Now, talking about Sanskrit, we have a lot of different elements of Sanskrit which are extremely useful. It's even fundamental, I would say, to this understanding of dualities and moving and transcending them as such, right? So one important thing, of course, is Sanskrit has a lot of different features, right, which are very important. And according to Ashtadhyay, right, we have these articulatory features, right? So some of the articulatory features are, for instance, voicing, right? How we voice, is it swara or is it anunasika? Right? So what is the form of the voicing? The breath amount, right? Whether it is alpa prana or mahaprana, which is basically articulated with a lot of breath involved in certain ways, or alpa prana means mild or not that much of breath being used all that much in that sense. Then there is another aspect of place of articulation, right? So for instance, is it kanthya or talavya, right? Which is basically talav we talk about, and kantha is your neck essentially. So where exactly is it kind of being articulated from, right? And then aspects of nasality, nasal aspects from the nose essentially. So each sound kind of has a relational way to define its identity, so to say, right? So the combinatorial and contrastive system helps us in understanding what is the difference between pa and ba and ka and ga, for instance, and so on, right? So this also reflects what Roman Jacobson, right, when he spoke about the theory of distinctive features, he also speaks about how these phonemes, right, these smaller units of sound are kind of differentiated among themselves, right? So the feature-based architecture is kind of helping us in not only encoding acoustic architectures, acoustics, the sound of it, but the degrees and spectrum of distinctiveness, right? And they are happening at a very, very foundational and fundamental level, right? So the way that Sanskrit helps us in that respect, I mean, there are a lot of different other languages also, I'll come back to Sanskrit in a bit, which also kind of gives us some insights into this. So for instance, in Russian, right, I was recently reading about a few of these languages, there is a distinguishing characteristic between what is a completed task and what is not a completed task, right? It's very interesting. So this temporal idea of completion is something which is hardwired in a manner of speaking in the language itself, right? So the duality of completion and being incomplete essentially. In Japanese, for instance, we have different honorifics, how you politely, the degree of politeness, how you are addressing people, right? You versus them, right? Again, the mode of doing that, right? There are certain qualifying elements in Japanese, right? In Piraya language of Amazon, right? It's very interesting. The other side of it, there aren't words for many and few, right? These distinctions on the quantitative side, there are certain restrictions on that front. There aren't those words essentially. And so one wonders, how do you even articulate that?
Yes.
Right? So there are certain ways that you do that essentially and contextually speaking. And again, on the flip side, you will see that in Garhwali language, right? I was recently, I heard about this, even for bad odor, right? The smell, element of smell, they have about, I don't know, 15 to 19, 17 or 19 different words for the kinds of bad odors that you get from different sources, right? Okay. So if it is, I don't know, sewage, right? Or some other kind of source, there are different ways in which they kind of qualify that using the same, using just one word. It's not like when we say in English, we say a very, very bad odor, right? Or jaghanna, we say jaghanna, right? Jaghanna means absolute disgusting, essentially, right? In Bengali, jagonno, smell. So the point is, they are not requiring anything else. They're not requiring qualifying words per se, right? So why is this important? Because it's not about whether you can construct these ideas of dualities in a bigger picture. It is about how concisely and how efficiently you can do it. Right? That is very important. So there is a very well-known kind of hypothesis called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which says that your language, right, articulates the ways of thinking as well. Right? So for instance, in this context, you would say that the particular binary categories depends or encoded in your native language influence which dualities you can relate or represent in your culture, right? Or in your civilization ethos. So going back now to Sanskrit.
I mean, more than 10 words maybe to describe Agni.
Right.
More than that to describe Surya.
Absolutely.
Light.
Absolutely.
And in fact, profoundly, give emphasis on something to do with light.
Yes. So even in fact, for instance, Gamanam, I think I mentioned about this Gau and Gamanam, right? This movement, aspect of movement. I mean, there are so many ways you can kind of define that, and the poetic aspect of it, right? That brings in layers of meaning, right? Which is so beautiful, right? So here, for instance, in India, in Bharat, we have had discussions of nirguna and saguna, nirakar, sakara. There are different binary categories that we have looked at in the past, right? And there are certain extensive case paradigms. There are certain kind of participial constructions, right? Which give us very efficient ways to encode. Right? This word called encoding. As I said, in Garhwali, you could have said the same thing in a number of different ways, but you had exactly the correct kind of attribution and articulation for it, right? Similarly, in Sanskrit, we have different elements which help us in doing that in a much more efficient manner, right? Which is why I see this as a feedback loop, right? The language is from the thought process, but the thought process is also by the language, and the articulation helps in terms of expanding forward, but that in turn helps the articulation. Right? So it is a continuous cycle of sorts, right? Which kind of is very important. So for instance, when Sri Adi Shankaracharya talks about the Sat and Asat aspect, right? He's expressing something much more than what we can relate to in everyday life necessarily. And many a times it is the sufficiency of the language or the rigor of that language, right? If you say Brahman, which is Anirvachaniya, right? Even in that we say Satchitananda. Right? So the first question that should come to mind, if it is anirvachaniya, then how are you talking about Satchitananda? Right? So there is definitely a degree of qualification, degree of description that does exist for Brahman per se. Right? So even at that level, I mean, even in modern attempts, we are looking at physics today, we don't have a way to describe not wave, not particle. Right? People say, what is it then? Right? Is it a wave-on? There is a theory, wave-on theory, and neither or. What is it? Right? So we are still struggling as it stands today, right, to describe many of these categorical, transcending kind of scenarios, essentially, right? Now, neurological kind of evidence also shows that certain areas of the brain, like Broca's and Wernicke's areas in our brain, which relates to, language processing, they are also active when you are thinking in certain ways, right? You are foundationally, abstract reasoning, for instance, or hierarchically structuring, points in your mind. There are ways in which it correlates, right? So we see that language and thinking, even at a very biological level, at a very fundamental level, there is a correlation that exists between the two, right? Now, however, we have seen that across the world, there are ways in which sustained attention practices has helped us in transcending the confines of the language, right? The confines of linguistic articulation itself, right? So for instance, we can see language is both a constraint as well as a liberating tool as well, right? So for instance, when we're talking about, there's a very interesting example, we were talking about poetry and double meaning or layered meaning. Kalidas's Meghadoot, right? When we talk about Kalidas's Meghadoot, there is a passage where there is an exiled yaksha, and he's looking at a cloud, right? And the cloud is a cloud, but it is also a messenger of sorts, right? So there's a dual aspect there. And there's a very beautiful shloka, which is verse 1.5, which says, Dhyuma jyotiha salila marutam sanipata kwa megha samdeshartha kwa patukaranai pranibhi prapanyah ityotsukyad apariganayan guhyakash tamam yayache kamarta hi prakriti kripanasha chetana chetaneshu, which means a cloud is but a mingling of smoke, fire, water and wind. How can it serve as a messenger, and how can words be carried without the skill of living beings? Yet, overcome with longing, the yaksha did not weigh such doubts, for those pierced by love, are by nature helpless, right? Whether dealing with the sentient or the insentient, right? So this tension doesn't quite weaken the poem, it actually reinforces it, right? It actually brings together these cosmic process and the human emotion in a very, very powerful way in which consciousness is expressed, right? So, and the key lies in linguistic sophistication, right? How do you become aware of the words that shape our world while simultaneously using the words to skillfully point to their own limitations, right? If you can reach that level of sophistication, then we are talking about what the seers, the luminaries of Bharat, right? They had always dealt with the words, but also looked at the limitations and gone beyond it. And over time, the language, and even before as well, because Sanskrit is called a mantric language, right? Mantras and the Bij mantras, right, are very, very foundational, essentially, right? So even at that level, there is an element of transcending what it itself is representing, That's the beauty of it. That's the duality, the ultimate duality, right? You're articulating and at the same time transcending the articulation, right? And that is why I say that Sanskrit is such a powerful language, right? Because it is doing that dual aspect in real time, right? And that is what makes it so powerful.